But before I dive in, just a little bit of background context about who I am and where I work. So I work at ThreadUp. We have our booth over there. We're the world's largest online consignment store. And I was telling someone this just like a minute ago, and they were like, yeah, but like, what does that mean? So I was like, oh, well, let me go put a video and I can try to explain. So we have 4 distribution centers across the US where we get millions of items, and then we automate the ability to, process them, take photography, ship them, and everything. It's pretty crazy. So when I say like online consignment, that's actually what it is. Okay, so you're also probably wondering like, what is a product person doing at a Ruby conference? I am a Ruby engineer. I was a Ruby engineer for almost a decade. And just kind of went up through engineering leadership and went into product as well. So I'm responsible for engineering and product at ThreadUp. And then we have an office in Kiev, brand new office. It's amazing. And we work in this cross-functional pod system. So this is like embedding the engineers within the business so they can be a part of our strategy, our roadmap, our features, our tests, our analyses, everything. And then from a tech standpoint, on our front end, we have an isomorphic React Apollo single-page application, and then GraphQL orchestration above that, and then Ruby behind the scenes. And we migrated to Kubernetes a little bit over 2 years ago. Okay, so I'm talking about continuous delivery today. And this is the like formal definition, the ability to get changes of all types into production and into the hands of users safely and quickly and in a sustainable way. And the person who coined this term was Jez Humble. This is his that top book. That's where he kind of like laid out what continuous delivery is. And then he's been writing more and more ever since. And I highly recommend his latest book, Accelerate. If you haven't read this and you're in engineering leadership or product leadership or you want to aspire to be in that, highly recommend that book. Okay, so the talk is about misadventures and continuous delivery. That's continuous delivery. These are engineering misadventures. I'm going to go through and talk through some of like our horror stories, so like try not to judge us too much. But the purpose is, I would hope that people can learn from the mistakes that we made. And then I also think that like when you get into the nitty-gritty details, like everyone can kind of relate to like, oh my God, I've been there, that is awful. And then the last thing is, I've been at ThreadUp for almost 10 years now, and when I joined, I was the first engineer, and now we have close to 60, 70 engineers. And then when I started, we were doing like a couple $100 in revenue a day, and now we're doing close to $1 million in revenue a day. So we've been going from like 10,000 users to 50 million users. And I think that scaling experience is really hard to get, because if you're a small startup, you never have to worry about scale. It's just like not really a thing. But then you go to a big company and then you learn how they operate at scale, and then you get their blueprint. So it's like, okay, this is how Google does this. This is how Twitter does this. But it doesn't enable you to build your own blueprints. I think like the scaling process of making all those mistakes and learning like why something didn't work is very, very valuable. So I'm trying to kind of offload that so you don't have to go through all the hardship that we did. Okay, so this isn't working. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to build out a list of like the ways to tell if you have a problem with continuous delivery. And just to start with like a quick show of hands, who here has worked in e-commerce? Okay, so quite a bit. All right, so keep your hand up, and I'll keep your hand up for a second. All right, have you ever heard, so keep your hand up if you've ever heard of Cyber Week. Okay, so there's some people here. So Cyber Week is like this, okay, one last one. Keep your hand up if you've ever had to do any work related to Cyber Week. Okay, look around. These are the people who you need to like buy a drink after this conference, because like this is the least desirable engineering work you'll ever have to go through. Cyber Week is this time in November where we do all these promotions. And this is actually an example of every day, this is like a real screenshot of like the days of Cyber Week. We have all these different promotions we need to give to our customers across all of our different platforms. And if that wasn't complicated enough, we segment it by like an ML score that basically says like what's the propensity to need a promotion to make the next purchase. So like this is like a Rubik's Cube of things that we have to like figure out and make happen. And if you're the engineers who's stuck doing this, this is like a pretty good way of like what it's like being there. Like this train coming is like this like Cyber Week promotion, and you're this person who's just trying to keep the train going. And sometimes you're just doing everything you can just to just like prevent it from being an absolute train wreck. And yeah, okay. So this was a really stressful time for any engineer. This was like 3 years ago, that screenshot that I showed. And it was so stressful that we decided to start like freezing our code, like basically saying like no one can merge into master right around this time, because that engineer or those engineers are going to be so stressed out, like the last thing they should have to worry about are like more changes happening. And I would actually say this is like the first symptom that you might have a problem with continuous delivery. If you're doing code freezes ever, I would say that like there's probably something wrong with the way that you practice continuous delivery. Okay, but you're probably like wondering, like how would we choose who had the honor of being this engineer to code Cyber Week? And it's this. It's like luck of the draw. So we flipped the coin to see who had that honor. And this look of horror on Ben Affleck's face, like that's what it actually feels like. And you're also probably thinking like, okay, how bad could it be? It's just like you wire up all of those things, and then like you're done, you move on. Well, at the time, our deploy pipeline looked a little bit like this. You started it off, and like I started doing some work. It was Capistrano, and then like you start to compile some assets. Maybe you kick that asset off to S3, and then there it goes. And then maybe your health check goes, and if everything's good to go, like the load balancer opens up, and then customers can kind of come in. It's a bit hyperbolic. This isn't actually what it looked like, but it was pretty bad. And at the time, a big part of continuous delivery is the technology itself. And the CI pipeline is a very important subset of continuous delivery. And so at the time, like we actually failed all of these. Like the deploy pipeline, it wasn't quick. It wasn't safe. If something actually broke, it might be in a partial state where it didn't just gracefully roll back. If you did want to roll back, it essentially took just as long as deploying in the first place, so like what was the point? And then all of this made the deployment process not sustainable. Not every engineer felt comfortable deploying. And then at the end of the day, like then you have people who weren't confident. They were like, oh yeah, like I don't want to deploy on a Friday. Like I don't want anything mess anything up. I don't want to deploy around a sale. So one year we got really lucky. So that year we had our laziest engineer take on that effort. And to quote Bill Gates, I choose a lazy person to do a hard job because a lazy person will find an easy way to do it. And what he did was he actually automated the entire week. So this is our feature flagging system. You can pump in like criteria to it, and then you can use it to determine like what customers should see what features, and you can do rollouts, and you can like kill things server side. It's wonderful. So he did this, and he was able to sit back and relax and like have as enjoyable as a Cyber Week as you can possibly have. And I honestly, like, this was like the second thing that I saw. It's like, okay, he's using some system that simply gets around like how complicated or how painful it is to get code live. And so I think if you see your team implementing delivery workarounds, you probably have a problem with continuous delivery. So we did a lot of work to kind of invest in our CI pipeline, so like that. The technology portion of continuous delivery, and we upgraded Kubernetes, and like everything was great, and it allowed us to get a little bit further towards continuous delivery. At this point, we were able to get changes into production safely and quickly, but a lot of this text is grayed out, and that means that we had more mistakes to make. Okay, so the last show of hands, and it's just only one question. Raise your hand if you've ever tried to decompose a monolith. Yeah, a lot more hands. Okay, so then you'll understand that it's like super easy, right? Like you just like get it done in like a couple sprints, and like the deploy, no big deal. So this was actually like what our monolith decomposition looked like. It's a subset of our architecture, but the gist of it was we had all of these clients. They were talking to some of the backends. Some of them were talking to some of the persistence layers directly. It was a bit of a mess. So what we wanted to do was, and this is actually closer to what it looks like now today, put everything behind GraphQL and then start just decomposing a bunch of the responsibilities outside of the monolith into separate services. And then have all of those sit behind the GraphQL layer, so we have like standardization from like API and caching and all that fun stuff. And so this actually took, as you can imagine, took a lot of time. And this is kind of like a sequence of all the things we had to do. We didn't do this in one single project. But in our heads, like we went at this and we were trying to be professional and calculated. And we thought that it would feel something like this, where like you're getting ready for this like big launch, and everyone is kind of like at their desk, ready to go. And then the launch, wow, just skipped a bunch ahead. And then the launch starts, and then there's like this great communication, and like everything's working exactly how it should be working, and then it's like, lift off, and it's great, and then afterwards, everyone's celebrating. Like in our heads, that's how we thought these sort of like big system migrations were gonna go. In reality, it looks a lot more like this. You're at your desk, you're stressed, things aren't going well, it feels like the world's burning around you. Then it's time for the deploy. It just fails spectacularly right at you, like very, very quickly. quickly. And then afterwards, like when it's all said and done, it probably went like 3 times as long as it was supposed to go. You just want to do this. You're just done. You just like want to be anywhere but, in the deploy room. So this was something, so we were doing the time we're calling like whole shot deploys, where we were just trying to put these new systems up and then kind of make it all happen in one thing, migrate the database, everything was like going live into production at the same time. And it was really problematic for us. So like, staging and production, they're just not the same thing. And there were continually issues that were like, oh yeah, we forgot that like our staging isn't behind a CDN and there's some custom things we do there and HA proxy this, whatever. And then we also spent a ton of time in QA doing these like dry runs, doing these practice runs, and it took forever. And then when something did go wrong, it was, the site goes down, we're not getting any money, that's risky for the business, and that risk was like really stressful for the team, especially when there were times when like database isn't coming back up and it's been a couple hours now and we don't know what's going on. Like that's really stressful. And then that repeated stress is like what burns people out. Like you eventually get to a point you're just like, yeah, I just like don't want to be involved in this like monolith decomposition. It's gonna kill me. So I would say like this was kind of like the next step in like our journey through continuous delivery is we realized that like these large system migrations were really stressful and we needed to change something because like we are still decomposing that monolith like years later, and so we needed something that allowed us to continue to do that over time without all of us wanting to jump out a window. Not sure why that keeps jumping. Okay, so at the time, this is how we were doing feature branching. And it looks like so simple and so elegant. Oh, you branch off of master and you're on this like feature branch, you do all this work. I would say this is actually what it's like when you do feature branching that way. You branch off of master and then you have your feature branch, but then the other engineer creates their feature branch off of your feature branch, and then like you spend a bunch of time committing, and then at some point you're like, yeah, we're ready, and there's this step here called hell, and I think it is like spot on. Anyone who's tried to like rebase their feature branch or multiple feature branches like off of master after like a month of time, oh yeah, it's hell. And then you do like QA and you fix and you keep rebasing, and then like maybe you're ready, you get into production, it goes into production, and then like something goes wrong, and then like we get to like roll back a feature, and then as an engineer, like you spend all this time putting the feature live, and then you have to like roll it back and then like go back to the drawing board. Just like, yeah, just want to like disappear from the planet at that point. And so I think like this was, we were doing a bunch of things to kind of improve across these like earlier symptoms that we had that something was off. But this was kind of the next one, and it was if flipping on or giving a feature to your customers is like harder than flipping a switch, you're just probably doing something wrong. And so we talked about the technology piece of continuous delivery, and I would say this is like not really a technology. This is just like the way that you work. And so we went is something more towards this. And it looks kind of similar, but in a very nuanced way, it is different. And this is, you branch off and you just do like one small component. You might be on a feature, you might be on a migration, but you do that one small component, and then you go through code review, and then you merge it in, and right into master. So everything is always going right into master. And one of the things that it prevents is like, if you've ever been on one of those feature branches and someone opens up the pull request and tags you to review their code, and you see it and it's like 11,000 lines of code across like 152 files, and they're like, hey, can you review this by Monday? It needs to go live on Tuesday. And you're just like, yeah, no, that's never gonna happen. So we try to work, and like anything that we do can be broken down in these like smaller components. And what it really helps us for is like code review first, like is so much easier. Like you always have time to review, 27 lines of code across 2 files. That's very manageable. You can do that, have a coffee, and like move on with your life. The second thing is like, because we're getting it into production, and we would put them behind feature flags. So the feature might not be functional. It might not even like the customer might not even see anything. But the code is there in production, and so everything you're doing is like, there is no rebasing off of master when you have like 1,000 commits. You just don't have to worry about that. And then what we can do is like, when it's ready for like maybe like our product team to like review like one part of the feature, we just opt them in, and they can kind of see that one part, and then we're getting feedback earlier. We're getting feedback like when it's in production, versus like when you're at the end of a project and it's like, the last 10% of the project feels like another 90% of the project. Like you get there and you're like, yeah, this will be live in like a week. And then like 6 weeks go by, and then like you're still getting feedback, and it completely changes everything you decided like 6 weeks ago when you're doing implementation. Like we try to avoid that at all costs. But the other benefit is like these smaller chunks it's much easier to like time estimate like what that like one form on this one page can do, or what this like one API end route, like how difficult that's going to be to figure out that data contract and what table it's coming from. And that predictability is much more sustainable. It means that like if you have a sprint and it's 2 weeks, it's like actually a sprint that's 2 weeks, and you can actually go home when you're supposed to and like have your weekend when you're supposed to. And then you don't have to worry about this bit where it's like the last 10% is feels like it's like 100% of the project. And I think that this was a big learning for us, because it actually, my CTO used to always tell me like, we need to find a way to like move faster. And I'd be like, yeah, we can do that. But like, we're going to have some quality issues. Like we might have bugs. We might have, things that are like wrong. We might have to like pay down more technical debt in the future. And then, he'd be like, okay, well, you can focus on the quality stuff. And I actually was like really against this notion of like, yeah, I can move fast or I can code with quality, but I can't do both. They're mutually exclusive. And when we made this change, I think we actually debunked this, because like we actually do move faster than we used to, and the quality is so much better. We're not compromising our code at the end of a project because we're so sick of it, and we're just like, whatever the product team wants, fine, we'll just do it and move on. We can actually like hone our craft with every small bit of the project, and code quality is better, and we're moving fast. So we got part of this process down, and so we had a technology piece, we had the process piece, and we were getting like very close. At this point, we had the ability to get changes, including features and experiments into production safely and quickly in a sustainable way. But as you can tell, like there's a part missing here, and so there's another failure. And this one was my failure. So we were doing this like, this is last summer. We were doing this like big launch for the Real Housewives of New York City. Don't ask if you don't know who they are. You don't want to know. And it was featured across like all of these big publications, and we were going to get like a huge traffic hit, like millions of people coming in a short amount of time. And the way that these work are, you have this thing called like an embargo, where like everything goes live at like 6 a.m. in this situation in Pacific time. And so it's like no one can like leak it early. So all the traffic hits at once. And like in that moment, it's like really important everything's working. You can kind of see where this is going. So like 15 minutes before it was going live, someone on the marketing team was like, oh, I have like one request. And I was like, yeah, we don't really like do requests like 10 minutes before a huge launch. And they're like, we just want you to change a link. So I was actually up and I was talking to the engineer, and I was like, what do you think? And he's like, it's just a link, right? Like, like what could it really do? It's just one line of code. And he opens up the PR, I look at it, it's like, yeah, it's just a link. It goes live. This is like 11 minutes to showtime, and yeah, it's all just broken. Kind of a long story short on like why that one line actually did this, but when this happens, like I was like, oh, it's fine, we'll just roll it back. We'll have it live. And then I realized that like myself, I was so used to our Ruby applications, and rolling back was super simple with Capistrano. When we moved on to Kubernetes, it's actually easier, but I had not used Kubernetes before. And the engineer who was with me was like a really junior engineer who had started like 2 weeks before. And I was like, oh my God, like I actually don't know how to roll back on Kubernetes. This is awful. But like, oh, I've been at the company for 9 years. Like I know like our architecture inside and out. Like I can totally figure out a way to like bypass our CI pipeline and like get that change live. So like my brain is like, thinking through like, oh, it was like, can I like edit the code directly on the server? Can I like, the pods are probably still there from the previous deploy. I can point to them. And then at a certain point, I just had to like accept the fact that like, yeah, no, I do not know how we're gonna get this back. It has to go through pipeline, has to go live. And then if you're wondering, like the change went live at like 6:06 a.m. And at that point, we had already lost 70% of all the traffic that was gonna come. So that one really hurt. And this one was, we had done all of that great work, and we actually have some engineers here who like did that work for us to give us all this great tooling to empower us, but not all the engineers knew how to use it. And I think this is actually a really important piece here. If everyone isn't kind of, if you don't evangelize the technology and the tooling and like what you can do to build your own services, like we don't give our tickets to like our infrastructure team. Like they give us the tools, then every engineer has the ability to spin up their own services to do their own pipelines and so on. But if you have devs who don't ops, you're going to run into situations like this. And I would actually say that there's like the seventh learning is, I was complacent. Like I actually thought like, well, we had kind of worked through all of these, and we had completely changed, our architecture. We had completely changed our infrastructure, our tooling, so on. We changed the way we worked, and I was like, we're good to go. And I would say like this is the final learning. If you like think that you're good, you probably have a problem, because like this is something that's like a living, breathing organism. It changes when you hire new engineers. It changes when your business changes. And so if you're not constantly like rethinking continuous delivery as you scale, you're going to run into problems like we did. And so I'll leave you with a note here. This is just humble, and I completely agree with this. It's not like profound, but I think it's spot on. The most important characteristic of high-performing teams is that they are never satisfied. They always strive to get better. So I would just keep that in mind as you think about continuous delivery. And that's my talk.
Thank you, Dan, for such great talk. Questions? Yes, we have one, please. 1 second.
Yes, thank you for the speech. I have one question. You mentioned feature flags in the middle of your story, but as I understand, you're still using them because you need somehow to hide your not ready features, yeah?
Yeah. So we use our feature flagging system for a lot of things now. So for features, we use them for system migrations. So we actually stopped calling it feature flagging for this reason. We also use it for all of our A/B tests because at the end of the day, what it was doing, it was saying which customers should see what things, and then any application can subscribe to this and say should they see this backend or that backend, and should they see this feature or that feature. So typically we put everything behind what we use a software service called Split. We put everything behind that, and then that just stays only available to engineers. And then when we're ready, we kind of opt whitelist in our product team, and then eventually we'll do 5% of customers, 10%. But it's the same for features, tests, and migrations.
So in general, you are making this gradual rollout of different features and releases, and as I understand, your kind of code already has everything when you deploy, and then you just gradually edit.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of times the code's been there for sometimes weeks or months, and that's a big benefit. We're not trying to think hey, how is this going to handle in production traffic? It's been there. We're not going to have to worry about other dependencies we haven't thought of. Everything's been in production for a long time at that point.
And just for me to understand, I'm also trying right now to grasp my head how to apply feature flags in our product right now, and as I understand, so feature flags eventually would go out of the code. So when you will completely understand that feature is, I don't know, if it's working correctly for some months, yeah, so you would remove it in the next release, for example.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is an area that you need to have some good hygiene to take care of it. We probably have too many of them, 50, 60 that are live, because we do a lot of tests, we do a lot of features. But yeah, you need to go back and remove the ones that are there to stay. But there have been times where we've left feature flags in for a year or two, so that in the event we have a certain service that's all behind a feature flag, and for whatever reason that portion of the architecture is struggling, we can just be oh, we're going to turn off the ability to favorite items from our customers, just to kind of alleviate load on this database. So to some extent, we kind of use it as a circuit breaker.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any other? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the speech. Continue about feature flags. Don't you face with the issues when, for example, you can face this bug when this and this feature flag is turned on, and these two are turned off?
The question is what happens when you have things where maybe a customer or a person is in a certain set of a bunch of feature flags, and it itself creates a bug. So we actually use they're basically we call them swim lanes, but we have high-level traffic allocation within the service called Split. And so we might have, so we work in these cross-functional teams where everyone has autonomy to kind of our applications function more as open source repositories, so everyone can commit to them as long as they adhere to the best practices. And it also means that people can commit and deploy without getting approval across the rest of the organization, so we can move faster. But one of the problems is this, what if you have someone who's testing something on your homepage, and then it has this one flow that goes throughout your entire experience, and then someone's testing on top of that. So what we decided to do is we give these high-level swim lanes to our relevance team, for example, and they can have 20% of all customer traffic. And then another team maybe is doing A/B testing on for customer acquisition, and they can have 20% of the traffic. And it allows you to kind of have your feature flags within these swim lanes so that it can't conflict. And it's also really important for A/B tests and making sure the data doesn't get polluted. But we used to have that problem, but that's how we solved it.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, thank you.